This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 446, entitled, "If I were a Masculist member of a Parliamentary Committee on Gender Equality." Description. This flyer imagines my vicarious self as a future Masculist member of a Parliamentary Committee on Gender Equality, pushing for the many legal and political changes needed for the menfairing of society, the creation of a FIP Society, the legislation of the para, the reform of the divorce courts, etc. The flyer itself. If I were a Masculist member of a Parliamentary Committee on Gender Equality, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. I'm a Marx, not a Lenin. I'm a theorist, a loner, an individualist who does not like group conformist pressure, so dream up my Masculist ideas privately and spread them via the internet. My personality is not suited to being a gender politician, with all its smooching, its political compromises, its human orientation, rather than a theoretical orientation. So I write this flyer imagining that I'm living vicariously as a Masculist gender politician in a Parliamentary Committee on Gender Equality. Hopefully there will be some Masculist Lenin who devotes his adult life to pushing the Masculist political agenda. So this flyer is about me imagining how this Masculist Lenin will go about his career in the, in brackets, hopefully not too distant future. Step 1 in this process, I imagine, is that Masculist ideas need to spread sufficiently so that they reach that 1 in a million guy who gets really fired up and decides at a young age, or even at middle age, to devote the rest of his career to pushing the Masculist political agenda. How might he start? So imagine some freshly elected MP, that's Member of Parliament, who is a passionate Masculist, who is out to create a FIP Society, who is out to liberate men from decades of manslavery to fluffy parasites, who is out to push through the para, that's paternity rejection right, who is out to menfair the gender laws, dozens of them, who manoeuvres himself into a slot in the existing Gender Equality Committee in his country's parliament. Of course, in today's world, gender equality is a euphemism for women's equality, since all the members of that Gender Equality Committee will probably be female and ardent feminists, self-selected to push the feminist agenda to give women real power by increasing the number of women in Parliament and in the boardrooms of companies, that is, pushing the political and social agenda of the third wave feminists, that is, to give women equal power, real power, in political and economic terms with men. Just how this crypto-biconscious Masculist will manage to wheedle himself into such a committee full of monoconscious feminists who, by definition, know nothing about masculism, who don't question the idea that gender oppression is a one-way street, who see men as the oppressors and women as the oppressed, who cannot even conceive of the reverse case being true, is an interesting question. Perhaps he is a real smoocher and says the right things that the monoconscious feminist members of the committee want to hear from men. His pro-feminist opinions will not be lying on his part, since he is a biconscious Masculist. He's just as aware of feminist ideas as he is of masculist ideas, which is to say that he knows what the feminists know, but also has a basis for comparison, since he also knows what the masculists know, that is, how women oppress men, and in fact worse, due to women's decades-long man-slaving parasitism. He has a basis for comparison on how each gender oppresses the other that the feminists do not have. To start with, he could, for example, push for a maternity wage given to women during the 6 years that they stay at home to raise their small children. And as a masculist, he will see that such a thing is not only in women's and feminists' interests, but in men's as well, since if the mother, the wife, drops out of the workforce to raise her 2 small children, then he will be left carrying the financial can. So if he loses his job for some reason, that will place enormous stress on him. So if his wife is getting a maternity wage from the government, that stress will be much less. As a masculist, he knows that giving women equal rights with men is in men's self-interest, since one of his major political aims is to help create a FIP Society, to legislate the para, etc. So women will need to have equal rights and equal power as prerequisites for the essential fipping of women, which will be his major task, if ever men are to be truly freed from man-slavery by fluffy parasites who do not bother to fip up, who don't bother to get a career-competent education at high school and college, who then go on to obtain fluffy crap diplomas that the economy doesn't value. So then look around in her 30s when her biological clock is ticking for some gullible, ignorant, stupid, man-slavable man to work for her, thus enslaving him for decades, a major gender crime. When he is lobbying to become a member of the Gender Equality Committee, he will have to be very careful about his masculist opinions, since many of those feminists already in the committee will very likely be real misandrist, monoconscious bigots who are incapable of seeing that women oppress men. So if these feminists discover that his real agenda is to reform the Gender Equality Committee so that it does in reality what its label says it does, that is, to create a committee that consists half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that both feminist and masculist issues are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case today, since to almost everyone, if you use the term gender equality, they will automatically think of equality for women. Nearly everyone is monoconscious. The masculists still have a long way to go in persuading society that gender oppression is a two-way street. There need to be millions more masculists in every high school, every campus, in the media, writing books, preaching masculist ideas to the millions, so that some of these feminists on the committee are at least a bit open to the idea that gender oppression is a two-way street. The more public pressure there is coming from the voting public for the legislation of masculist issues, the more likely it will be that these feminists will listen, since they are, after all, politicians who have to listen to their voters, half of whom are men. So if they don't listen, they will be forced out of office by the masculisted men and the female masculisted women, who will be angry at these monoconscious feminists who see gender oppression as a one-way street. So let's imagine, one way or another, he gets a slot on the Gender Equality Committee. What will his first task be? He may have to play his cards carefully, since it may be possible that once he is discovered that his real agenda is to menfair the committee by having half the members feminists and half masculists, then the real power-hungry feminazi type feminists on the committee may use their majority power to have him thrown out. So he will need to be careful and over time bring in more men into the committee. Once he's in, he can start pushing for masculist legislation, for example, boy-fairing the primary schools, arguing that boys live in a gynocentric universe, having almost no male role models in their early years, since their fathers are out to work and their teachers are almost exclusively female. So these young boys grow up twisted, femaled, feminized. that goes against their genetic nature as boys, as males, with their male brains and male behaviours. This initially sole bi-conscious masculist in the Gender Equality Committee will need to be a real William Wilberforce, brackets, the British emancipator of the slaves in the UK, or a William Lloyd Garrison, the founder of the first abolitionist newspaper in the US, who can arguably be called the indirect father of the US Civil War, which was fought largely over the issue of the immorality of Negro slavery, close brackets. He will need to be a masculist champion who gets on the media in time, once he has more or less consolidated his position in the Gender Equality Committee. He can appeal to the self-interest of the feminists in the committee using masculist arguments that a bi-conscious feminist is much more likely to have a boyfriend than a monoconscious feminist who has been taught by feminism that it is men who are the gender oppressors and that it is women who are the oppressed. By learning some masculist ideas, the monoconscious feminist loses her monoconscious anger at men for the ways that men oppress women by becoming conscious, that is, bi-conscious, that women also oppress men, especially with their decades-long man-slaving parasitism. Thus, a bi-conscious feminist will have her feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women cancelled by her female masculine anger at women for the ways that women oppress men, and hence lose her gender political anger, and hence be much more approachable by men, thus will be more likely to benefit from having a man in her life, so is loved, sexed, orgasmed, babied, etc., rather than being a bitter, monoconscious feminazi bigot, MFB, whom men despise and avoid, forcing such women to rot on the shelf, since such misandrous females are repulsive to men. This bi-conscious masculist champion can really sell the vision of a FIP society to the media and to his colleagues in the committee, that it's not enough for women to be given equal rights with men, but that women also have to accept equal obligations with men by sharing out equally the burden of earning the living, by bothering to get a career competent education at high school and college, so that she can be a true FIP as an adult and not expect to parasite fluffy style off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades, making her a major gender criminal, a manslaver. Once there is a non-negligible number of male masculists in the committee, these bi-conscious masculists can then really start pushing for the legislation of the para, which probably, in historical terms, will prove to be as much a bataille royale, so a royal battle, as was the suffragette push for the vote. Think about the implications of the legislated right of men to reject an unwanted pregnancy. It will be terrifying for fluffies. It will force them to grow up, to FIP up, to take responsibility for their own lives, to stop blaming men, fluffy feminist style, for women's woes, and force them to control their own female destinies. In parallel with the fight for the para will be the reform of the divorce courts, which today are crime scenes against men, with the fluffy feminists having taken them over and made them so toxic for men by ripping a divorced father's kids away from him with a 90% probability, stealing half his wealth and stuff, handing it over to his fluffy ex-wife, his house too, forced to pay child payments to his kids whom he will barely see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy parasite, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, making her truly a gender criminal, hated by the masculists, who aim to wipe out such women by forcing women to FIP up so that fluffydom dies out. Masculists are very aware that the creation of a FIP society will go a long way in solving many of the major gender problems that men have. In a FIP society, if a couple with kids divorces, then the woman, the mother, is just as capable of pulling her financial weight after the divorce as is the man, the father, since she has been raised to be a FIP by parents, teachers and society. Both sexes will be pushing young women to be FIPs or pay a very heavy price of not getting a man, since young men will spit at fluffies, since young men will utterly reject being manslaved by a hated fluffy parasite who expects to live off the money and labour of a man for decades. This is the end of part 1.